Have you ever moved into a new place and immediately noticed something that just felt off?
Oh, yeah, I think we all have.
Right, like you know the feeling. You're unpacking boxes, the house is mostly quiet, and suddenly there's a draft where the structural plans say there absolutely shouldn't be one.
Or a really weird smell.
Exactly, like a metallic smell that you can't quite trace to the plumbing, or a sound that just completely defies basic acoustics.
And, usually the human brain just brushes it off. We tell ourselves, oh, it's just the wind or the house settling.
Yeah, or thermal expansion in the pipes, right? But what if you stopped, looked at the actual empirical evidence, and really listened?
Because sometimes it's not the wind.
No, it's not. What if the acoustic profile of that sound wasn't the wind moving through the walls, but something massive inhaling?
That is just terrifying to even think about. But, the human brain is literally hardwired to force rational explanations onto deeply irrational experiences.
We want to feel safe.
Exactly. We construct this intense psychological firewall to protect our sense of safety, especially within our own homes. When anomalous data breaches that firewall, our cognitive systems work overtime to, sanitize the threat.
Well, looking through the stack of architectural schematics, police reports, and recovered audio logs on the table today, that psychological firewall is exactly what we need to unpack.
Definitely.
We are doing a deep dive into the factual, highly documented case of the Carter family's disappearance from their isolated home in Hollow Creek.
And it's a wild case.
It really is. The incident reports outline a timeline that starts with a creaky floorboard and ends with an impossible biological anomaly.
And, the objective here goes far beyond simply recounting the events of an unsolved disappearance.
Right, there's a bigger picture.
Exactly. By analyzing all these primary sources, the blueprints, the audio forensics, the contractor testimonies, we are really dissecting the anatomy of a mystery.
Figuring out how a desperate mind rationalizes an expanding threat.
Yes, and looking at the historical purpose of architectural containment and the devastating biological consequences of just ignoring glaring warning signs.
And the tragedy of the Carter family didn't actually start with a monster hiding in the dark. According to financial records in the file, it started with a bargain.
It usually does, doesn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately. The Carters, so that's Daniel, Rachel, and their 12-year-old son Noah, they were facing severe economic insolvency.
Basically bankruptcy.
Yeah, they were weeks away from losing everything. And they found a lifeline in this incredibly cheap, isolated property surrounded by dense forest in Hollow Creek.
But the price was suspiciously low, right?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Based on the local real estate comps at the time, the price was a statistical impossibility.
Yeah.
It was simply way too cheap.
Which makes sense psychologically. Financial desperation operates as a really powerful cognitive blinder.
How so?
Well, when a person is under intense, chronic economic stress, their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, it essentially gets hijacked by the immediate crisis.
So they can't see the other dangers.
Right. The long-term threat of homelessness overrides all peripheral warning systems. Daniel and Rachel saw an affordable sanctuary, so their brains actively bypassed the obvious red flags.
And the red flags documented in the property history are glaring. I mean, the previous owner had abandoned the property mid-renovation, leaving most of his belongings behind.
Huge red flag.
Yeah. And the neighboring property owners flat out refused to discuss the house with the real estate agent.
Just completely silent.
Right. And then there's the architectural anomaly present on the original blueprints. It shows a sealed basement room, completely obscured behind heavy, immovable shelving units.
But despite all of this, they still finalize the purchase.
They do. They move in, and on their third night, the acoustic phenomena begin.
And the onset of these sounds, as detailed in Daniel's subsequent notes, is highly specific.
Yeah, they started around 2 a.m., right?
Yeah, almost exclusively around 2 a.m., yeah. From an acoustic standpoint, this is the window when the ambient noise floor of the surrounding forest and the internal mechanical systems of the house drop to their absolute lowest.
So the house is dead silent, basically acting like a giant acoustic amplifier.
Exactly.
Daniel initially documents the sound as a plumbing issue. But reviewing the transcriptions of what they actually heard, this is not the high-frequency rattle of water hammering in copper pipes.
Not at all.
The sources describe a low-frequency, rhythmic oscillation. It mimics slow, deep, immense lungs, expanding and compressing somewhere directly beneath the foundation.
And didn't their 12-year-old son say something about it?
Yeah, Noah comes down to breakfast the next morning and describes the sound in a deeply unsettling way. He just says, "It sounds tired."
Wow. Noah is assigning biological personification to an environmental anomaly there.
Which is pretty creepy.
It is, but children often lack the complex cognitive filters that adults use to sanitize their reality. A degrading water pipe does not sound tired. Settling timber does not sound exhausted.
So Noah's just processing the data without trying to normalize it.
Right, which naturally unnerves Daniel. It forces him to confront the possibility of a living entity rather than just a mechanical failure.
So by the fifth night, Daniel's cognitive firewall starts to crack a bit. The primary sources detail his initial investigation into the basement.
And the environmental conditions down there are highly specific.
Very. The ambient temperature drops significantly, the overhead lighting suffers from voltage fluctuations, and the porous concrete walls are actively sweating moisture.
Which indicates a drastic shift in humidity.
Yeah. And echoing softly through that damp space is the rhythmic oscillation. Inhale, exhale, pause.
So what does Daniel do?
He gets down on the concrete and presses his ear against the floorboards, and the moment he does this, the breathing instantly stops.
See, the cessation of the sound right there fundamentally alters the nature of the event.
Because it knows he's there.
Exactly. It transitions the phenomenon from a passive environmental irregularity to a responsive, environmentally aware entity. The source of the sound perceived his proximity.
Something beneath him holds its breath and then breathes back, significantly closer to his position.
That is just chilling.
It really is. And I look at Daniel's persistent dismissal of these events.
Yeah.
Blaming old infrastructure and thermal expansion. It's like ignoring a check engine light on a car dashboard.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Like a driver knows a mechanical failure is imminent, but they tape over the light to avoid the massive mechanics bill. Daniel is applying that same avoidance tactic, but with impossible supernatural stakes.
And the psychological concept at play here is normalcy bias. We construct our daily reality on a rigid framework of predictable physics.
Like gravity goes down, buildings don't move.
Exactly, and subterranean foundations do not respire. When sensory data completely violates those fundamental laws, the human brain faces a severe crisis.
But you either accept your immortal danger or you lie to yourself.
Precisely. You accept the new data, which requires admitting the physical laws of reality are broken, or you aggressively force this terrifying new data into an old, safe category. Like, it's just the plumbing.
But normalcy bias only functions when the illusion remains unchallenged by outside variables. And Daniel accidentally dismantled his own illusion by bringing in a third party.
Rachel wanted a structural inspection, right?
Yeah, she demands it, leading them to hire 2 local contractors. The incident reports note that the senior contractor, Frank Holloway, steps into the basement, registers the atmospheric drop, hears the low-frequency oscillation, and immediately turns pale.
He knew something was wrong right away.
He looks at the hidden, sealed room on the blueprints and references a warning passed out from his grandfather, who was a former logger in the area. The warning was explicit. Never dig under these hills.
And, we often dismiss local folklore as uneducated superstition, but anthropologists view it quite differently.
Really? How so?
Well, in many geographically isolated communities, generational stories and vague geographical warnings are actually encoded pragmatic survival data.
Like a warning label disguised as a ghost story.
Yes. Much like the ancient tsunami stones in Japan that told future generations where not to build. Frank's grandfather was transmitting vital geological or biological intelligence disguised as a local myth.
Well, the structural reality of the house forces their hand, regardless of the myth. The acoustic events escalate that night, prompting Noah to wake up terrified by what he describes as growling underground.
So it's getting more aggressive.
Yeah. The following morning, Daniel and the contractors dismantle the heavy shelving units to expose that hidden space. They uncover an industrial metal door set into the foundation.
And there's something really weird about that door in the crime scene photos.
There is a glaring, illogical detail. The door is secured by heavy sliding iron bolts, but the bolts are fastened on the outside of the frame.
Which is huge. The placement of those locking mechanisms recontextualizes the entire architectural intent of the basement.
Because usually, a lock is on the inside, right, to keep you safe from the outside.
Exactly. A standard foundational room, or storm shelter, utilizes interior locking mechanisms to secure the occupants. Heavy industrial-grade iron bolts affixed to the exterior of a subterranean door serve one specific function. They are designed for active containment.
They were not trying to keep the structural integrity of the house intact. They were keeping something confined below it.
And they just start smashing the bolts off anyway.
Yep, Daniel and the contractors force these oxidized bolts loose with a sledgehammer. And the acoustic oscillation, the breathing amplifies with every metallic strike.
Frank must have been freaking out.
He was. The senior contractor recognizes the shift in threat level and advises immediate evacuation. But Daniel refuses to stop. They force the final bolt, pull open the heavy metal door, and reveal that it does not lead to a room at all.
It's a tunnel.
A steep, descending subterranean tunnel.
And the opening of that tunnel introduces an immediate microclimate shift in the basement. The reports detail a sudden influx of warm, stagnant air carrying the distinct olfactory signatures of wet earth and advanced organic decay.
Basically, it smelled like rot. And the structural supports inside this tunnel are ancient, partially collapsed timber. But the detail that causes Frank Holloway to permanently abandon the job site involves the geological damage to the tunnel walls.
The claw marks.
Yeah. The solid stone surfaces are covered in thousands of deep, parallel gouges. Claw marks. Noah observes the damage and concludes that something has been trying to get out.
But a closer geological analysis of the gouge patterns alters that theory, doesn't it?
It does. The crime scene photos clearly show the striations pointing in both directions. Deep grooves scrape upward toward the door, while in equal numbers scrape downward into the dark.
That's a crucial detail.
Right, because if the physical damage goes both ways, this tunnel is not functioning merely as a cage. It operates as a commute.
Commute, wow.
Whatever is down there is treating this half-mile vertical shaft as a two-way street, pacing up and down in a routine, habitual loop.
And that behavioral pattern indicates routine mobility and territorial patrolling. It basically confirms the architectural theory regarding the exterior iron bolts.
That they weren't just building a normal house.
Right. The original builders of the Hollow Creek house did not excavate a basement. They capped a pre-existing active geological fissure. The house is essentially a heavy structural lid placed over a quarantine zone.
And Frank Holloway understands the implications of this commute instantly. He terminates his contract on the spot, pleading with Daniel to reseal the iron door before he leaves.
And Daniel asks him why, right?
Yeah, and Frank simply states, because it breathes. At this juncture, standard human self-preservation dictates fleeing the premises.
Get in the car and drive away.
Exactly. Daniel, however, opts for the exact opposite approach. He decides to initiate a solo descent into the unmapped tunnel.
Which is just, Daniel's decision to travel downward represents a dangerous psychological pivot. The passive denial mechanism has completely failed, forcing him into a state of extreme active rationalization.
And the environmental variables inside the home are deteriorating rapidly. With the containment door open, the acoustic breathing shifts position, echoing directly beneath the basement staircase.
It's moving up.
Yeah. The physical vibration of the inhales can be felt through the floorboards, and the thermal draft from the tunnel is continuously pumping warm, foul air into the living spaces. Rachel insists on immediate evacuation.
And Daniel still says no.
He counters by hypothesizing about underground gas pockets, pressurized mine ventilation, or seismic shifting. He literally gathers tactical flashlights and climbing rope and descends alone.
He's prioritizing the acquisition of empirical evidence over the immediate physical safety of his family.
I really struggle to buy that logic, though. I mean, if I hear giant lungs inhaling under my floorboards, my evolutionary threat response does not care about my mortgage or my desire for empirical evidence.
It shouldn't.
It pumps adrenaline into my system and tells me to sprint in the opposite direction. Isn't Daniel's descent a complete failure of basic human survival instinct?
Well, it appears as a biological failure from the outside, sure, but we have to look at the mechanics of a collapsing reality matrix. Daniel's brain is offering him two distinct realities.
Okay, what are they?
Reality A. There is an ancient, impossible biological entity living beneath his home, rendering him completely powerless to protect his family. Reality B. There is a pressurized gas pocket, creating an acoustic illusion.
So reality B means he still has some power.
Exactly. If it is a gas pocket, he retains agency. He can hire specialists, install ventilation, and save his family from financial ruin. To accept reality A is to accept absolute psychological destruction.
So his brain basically forces him to go prove it's a gas pocket.
Therefore, his brain mandates that he investigate the gas pocket to maintain the illusion of environmental control.
Well, that illusion of control shatters the deeper he goes. His descent log details a half-mile trek through a vertical, claustrophobic fissure. The claw marks are omnipresent.
And then he finds the carvings.
Yeah, eventually he encounters anomalous archaeological evidence. Crude symbols carved repeatedly into the stone. The translations in the police file indicate a repetitive warning. Do not wake it.
Just carved right into the rock.
Over and over. The tunnel eventually opens into a massive subterranean cavern. The floor of this chamber is a taphonomic nightmare. It is a sprawling boneyard.
Just covered in skeletons.
Daniel documents the skeletal remains of local wildlife, deer, coyotes, livestock, intermingled with dozens of human skeletons. The degradation of the bones suggests a sustained ecological timeline. Some remains are ancient and calcified, while others are disturbingly fresh.
And the presence of fresh biological material proves this is not a dormant archaeological site. It is an active, sustained ecosystem with an apex predator at the top of the food chain.
And the focal point of this bone-filled cavern is a second architectural anomaly. In the center of the chamber stands another massive door, heavily reinforced with iron and wrapped in thick, oxidized chains.
A second door.
Yes. And behind this second door, the low-frequency breathing is immense. Daniel is standing ankle-deep in a graveyard, staring at a chained containment breach and still attempting a DIY home inspection.
But Daniel's artificial reality finally collapses when the physical environment forces a confrontation.
It does. A deafening metallic snap echoes through the cavern. The tensile strength of one of the rusted chains fails, and the iron links hit the stone floor.
Oh, man.
The low-frequency oscillation deepens, and the acoustic data implies something impossibly heavy shifting its weight behind the iron. The threat is no longer theoretical.
He finally realizes what's happening.
Daniel finally abandons the illusion of control, turns and sprints the half-mile back at the vertical shaft, but the breathing pursues him the entire way.
See, Daniel's intrusion into that deep subterranean chamber functioned as a biological catalyst.
He basically woke it up.
Essentially, the entity was previously confined to a deeper geographical stratum. By traveling down the shaft, introducing light, and altering the atmospheric pressure, Daniel provided a vector.
So it followed him.
The threat is no longer contained below the foundation. The investigation actively invited the entity up into the primary living space.
Which brings us to the police timeline of their final night, mapping out an absolute masterclass in escalating environmental dread. A severe microclimate anomaly overtakes the house.
The window's fogging up.
Yeah. Despite the central heating system being deactivated, rapid condensation forms on the interior glass of every window in the structure.
And the sudden accumulation of internal condensation requires a rapid displacement of atmospheric conditions. It indicates a massive volume of warm, humid air infiltrating the cooler, dry environment of the house.
It's the thermal exhaust of the entity's respiration, now permeating the entire floor plan. Noah wakes his parents, reporting a tall figure standing in the darkness of his bedroom, emitting the low-frequency breathing.
And Rachel is finally done.
She abandons all discussion of financial stability and begins packing for an immediate dawn evacuation. But the timeline shows they do not make it to dawn. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the physical barrier between the basement and the ground floor is breached. The interior door creaks open.
The quarantine architecture has completely failed. The biological vector is now moving freely through the domestic space.
A thermal updraft pushes through the open doorway, followed by the acoustic signature of slow, heavy footsteps dragging across the linoleum. Daniel arms himself with a standard baseball bat and approaches the top of the basement stairs.
And what he sees is just unimaginable.
The visual data he processes is incomprehensible. The subterranean iron door is ajar. Leading away from the opening are tracks composed of wet earth and biological decay. The footprints are disproportionately massive, defying human bipedal morphology.
And the breathing.
The low-frequency oscillation is no longer localized. It is omnidirectional. A massive inhale pulls from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, and the subsequent exhale washes directly over the back of Daniel's neck.
Which means the spatial awareness demonstrated by the entity implies a highly advanced sensory apparatus. It utilized the acoustic blind spots of the basement to bypass Daniel's visual field entirely, positioning itself directly behind him.
So Daniel slowly turns around, and the physical description transcribed from the primary sources defies standard terrestrial biology.
It really does.
The entity is positioned near the staircase, its physical height rendering the basement ceiling an impediment. It possesses an elongated, emaciated frame devoid of pigmentation.
Completely pale.
Yes, and the skeletal structure of the limbs is heavily modified. The joints are inverted and bent backward, resembling the fractured legs of an animal forcibly reconstructed into a bipedal stance.
Which is horrifying, but biologically there's a precedent.
Well, wait, the most prominent morphological feature is the thoracic cavity. The chest expands to an impossible width with each rhythmic intake of air. The facial structure is entirely obscured by taut, translucent skin, featuring only a massive dark orifice that expands and contracts with the respiration cycle.
Okay, to understand how something like this exists, we have to look at the evolutionary biology of troglobites.
Troglobites, what is that?
A troglobite is an organism that has evolved to survive exclusively in the permanent darkness of deep cave systems. Real-world examples, like the Texas blind salamander, lose their pigmentation and eyesight over thousands of years.
Because they don't need them in the dark.
Exactly. Generating those traits wastes vital biological energy in a lightless environment. If we scale that evolutionary track up to an apex predator, the anatomy makes terrifying sense.
So no eyes make sense. What about the backwards legs?
Visual organs are obsolete, yes. And the inverted, fractured-looking limbs are not injuries. They are hyper-specialized adaptations designed for scaling vertical, irregular geological fissures, rather than walking flatly on the Earth's surface.
And the massive chest.
The massive, expanding thoracic cavity is the biological engine necessary to extract trace amounts of stagnant oxygen from toxic subterranean atmospheres.
Wow. Well, the application of that biological engine is documented in the final moments of Daniel's timeline. Paralyzed by the visual input, Daniel watches the entity slowly tilt its head.
It gets ready to inhale.
It initiates a massive, localized inhalation. The moment the entity draws breath, the electrical lighting in the basement immediately dies, simultaneously followed by Daniel's final recorded scream.
The lights going out is the most fascinating part to me.
How is that even possible? What is the mechanism behind that? How does a biological inhale extinguish an electrical current?
Well, the data implies an endothermic energy draw. In extremely deep, resource-starved subterranean environments, organisms must scavenge any available energy.
Like beyond just eating things.
Right. It is theoretically possible that this troglobitic predator does not just inhale oxygen. It acts as a biological thermal sink or an electromagnetic displacement field.
Wait, really? It breathes in energy.
When it requires massive amounts of energy to operate its biological systems, a deep inhalation could pull ambient thermal heat or static electrical charge straight out of the surrounding environment, thereby short-circuiting the weak electrical grid of the basement.
That is insane. Daniel attempted to apply human logic to a localized endothermic apex predator. By dismantling the exterior bolts and opening the structural lid of the fissure, he removed the only barrier separating his family from a biological impossibility.
And the aftermath confirms it.
The police documentation is grim. Hours after the 2:14 a.m. breach, law enforcement arrived at the Hollow Creek property. The structure was pristine. There was no forced entry, no signs of a physical struggle, and absolutely no biological trace of Daniel, Rachel, or Noah.
They just vanished.
The only remaining physical evidence was the subterranean door left wide open and thousands of fresh geological gouges covering the basement walls.
So the official investigation was forced to transition from a domestic disturbance protocol to a subterranean search and rescue operation.
The tactical logs from those search teams provide the final pieces of empirical data. Highly equipped rescue units navigated the vertical shaft, descending nearly 2 miles below the Hollow Creek property.
2 miles straight down.
Yeah, but they eventually halted the operation and refused to proceed further. The geological evidence dictated their retreat. The deeper they descended into the earth, the fresher and more abundant the claw marks became.
Meaning the creature was highly active down there.
And the acoustic forensics from the search team's final audio log reveals a chilling shift in the entity's behavioral pattern. The rhythmic oscillation echoing up from the depths no longer sounds distant, and it certainly no longer sounds tired.
It changed.
The frequency is rapid, aggressive, and highly motivated. It sounds hungry.
The entity is no longer dormant, and it is no longer contained within a localized routine. The biological vector has been permanently activated.
And today, the Hollow Creek house remains structurally intact, but completely uninhabited. Contemporary incident reports state that anyone attempting to utilize the property experiences the exact same acoustic phenomena.
The breathing always comes back.
Sometime after midnight, the low-frequency oscillation begins beneath the foundation. It establishes a rhythm. And night by night, the acoustic data proves the breathing is ascending the vertical shaft, moving closer to the structural lid.
It functions as a localized geographical anomaly, anchored to a subterranean ecosystem that modern science lacks the tools or, honestly, the desire to fully map.
Analyzing a deep dive like this forces you to evaluate the architecture of your own life. We all possess sealed doors, situations, geographical locations, or lingering anomalies that trigger our baseline threat detection systems.
We all have our own red flags we ignore.
We feel the atmospheric drop, we hear the illogical sounds. The question is, when do you push forward, insisting on empirical data and maintaining the illusion of control? And when do you finally acknowledge the warning signs, listen to the acoustic shift in the dark, and abandon the investigation before you permanently break containment?
Navigating that psychological threshold is the ultimate human dilemma, but the primary sources from the Hollow Creek file leave us with one final, unresolved variable that fundamentally alters our understanding of the threat.
Oh, right, the second door.
Exactly. We possess detailed physical descriptions of the highly adapted troglodytic predator that breached the basement. However, review Daniel's descent log from the cavern half a mile below the surface.
The boneyard.
He documented a second architectural barrier, a massive door reinforced with iron, wrapped in rusted chains. And before Daniel fled that cavern, the tensile strength of those heavy chains failed, and something impossibly heavy shifted behind that second door.
The descent log is explicit about that. The metallic snap occurred, the larger weight shifted, and the pale, elongated entity immediately began a rapid ascent up the shaft, closely followed by Daniel.
Right. And the timing of that ascent requires us to reevaluate the entity's motivation.
What do you mean?
Think about it. If the pale, troglodytic predator was agile enough to routinely commute up and down a 2-mile vertical shaft, gouging the walls for decades, it was not the entity trapped behind those thick, oxidized chains.
Wait.
Oh my God.
This introduces a catastrophic biological hypothesis. What if the pale, broken predator was never actively hunting the Carter family? What if the entity that breached the basement was simply fleeing from whatever managed to break the chains in the deeper chamber?
We assume the predator is at the top of the food chain until the empirical evidence suggests it's just running away from the actual apex threat.
Exactly.
Next time you find yourself standing in the dark, attempting to rationalize a sound that defies explanation, leave the flashlight off. Do not try to dismantle the mystery. Respect the containment.